The girl's hands would not stop shaking. She stood in the outer courtyard of the temple of Amun at Karnak, waiting. The linen of her ceremonial dress felt heavier than it had that morning. The priests had told her to keep her eyes lowered. They had told her many things. None of it prepared her for the silence that followed when the bronze doors closed behind the procession. Her name was Mutnefer. She was 14 years old. 3 months ago, her father had wept with pride when the temple officials arrived at their small house along the Nile. His daughter had been chosen, selected by the gods themselves, or so the priests said, to serve in the most sacred capacity a girl could achieve, a god's wife of Amun. The title sounded like salvation. It sounded like power. She would learn what it actually meant after the sun went down. The institution existed for over 1,000 years. Historians call it one of ancient Egypt's most fascinating religious offices. They describe it with careful language, a position of considerable influence, a role reserved for royal or noble daughters, a celibate priesthood of the highest order. What they mention less often is what happened in the inner chambers. The god's wife was not simply a priestess. She was chosen to be the earthly consort of the god Amun-Ra. In theory, this meant performing rituals, managing temple estates, wielding political authority that rivaled the pharaoh's own advisors. The role emerged during Egypt's New Kingdom, grew in power through the Third Intermediate Period, and by the 25th dynasty, the god's wife of Amun controlled vast wealth and territory. But theory and practice rarely share the same bed. Mutnefer had learned the public story. Every girl in Thebes knew it. The god's wife lived in luxury within the temple complex, adorned with gold, attended by servants, her word law within the sacred precincts. She would never marry. She would never bear children. She belonged to the god alone. What they did not tell her was how a god made his desires known. The high priest explained it 3 days after her arrival. His voice was patient, almost fatherly. The god did not speak directly to mortals. He required intermediaries. The priests who had served Amun for decades, who knew his moods, his appetites, his expectations. When the god wished to commune with his wife, the priests would convey his will. She would be expected to obey. The first time, she did not understand what was being asked. The priest who came to her chambers after the evening offering spoke in euphemisms so dense she thought he was describing a meditation ritual. He mentioned sacred union, divine mystery, the body as temple. When his hand reached for the clasp of her dress, understanding came too late. The role of God's wife was not always this way. In its earliest incarnations during the Middle Kingdom, the position held genuine religious significance without the darker implications. These women performed rituals, yes, but they were priestesses in the conventional sense. Intermediaries who maintained the temple, participated in festivals, ensured the proper flow of offerings. The transformation came gradually. As the priesthood of Amun accumulated power and wealth, as the temples became small kingdoms unto themselves, the god's wife evolved from religious figure to political tool. The pharaohs used the position to consolidate control over Thebes. The priests used it for something else entirely. By the time of the 25th dynasty, the god's wife of Amun controlled the second-largest income in Egypt after the pharaoh himself. She adopted heirs rather than bearing them. She ruled estates, commanded servants, issued decrees. But at night, when the temple fell silent and the public rituals ended, she was still a girl who had been given to men who spoke for an invisible god. Mutnefer learned to recognize the footsteps. Each priest had his own rhythm on the stone floors. The high priest moved slowly, deliberately, his sandals barely whispering. The younger ones walked faster, their eagerness poorly concealed. They always came after the last offering of the day, when the temple workers had withdrawn and the outer gates were sealed. They always spoke the same words, "The God has called for you." She tried to refuse once. The second week, when a priest she had never seen before appeared at her door. She said she was tired. She said she needed to prepare for the morning ritual. She said anything that might make him leave. He did not leave. Instead, he reminded her of what she had been taught. The god's will was absolute. To refuse the god was to invite chaos, to threaten Mayat itself, the cosmic order that held Egypt together. Was she willing to risk the flooding of the Nile, the success of the harvest, the safety of her family? He reminded her that her father had 7 other children. She did not refuse again. The historical record is remarkably silent on this matter. We have extensive documentation of the gods' wives of Amun, their names, their lineages, their building projects, their political maneuverings. We know which god's wife allied with which pharaoh, which priesthood faction they supported, how they managed their estates. Inscriptions praise their piety. Relief carvings show them making offerings, their bodies rendered in the formal artistic conventions that denied them individual humanity, but their private experiences, the reality of their days and nights within the temple complex? Nothing, or nearly nothing. The few hints that survive come from medical papyri that mention treatments for conditions common among the temple priestesses, remedies for trauma to intimate areas, instructions for preventing conception despite supposed celibacy. These documents are clinical, detached, offering solutions without acknowledging the problems that necessitated them. The silence is not accidental. Mutnefer kept a private count, not of days, those blurred together in an endless cycle of ritual and waiting, but of the men who claimed to speak for the god. By the end of her first year, she had stopped counting. The number no longer mattered. The god, it seemed, had many voices. She learned other things, too. She learned that the servants knew but would never speak of it. She learned that her predecessor had requested poison from the temple physician and been refused. She learned that the title, God's wife, was permanent. There was no returning to her father's house, no escape except through death or the rare political upheaval that saw one priesthood replaced by another. She learned that the gold she wore was not a gift, but a price. Most importantly, she learned that no one would help her. Not the other priestesses, who had their own survival to consider. Not the temple scribes, who recorded only what they were told to record. Not the pharaoh, who needed the priesthood's support and would not jeopardize it for one girl's suffering. Not the common people of Thebes, who saw her in processions and believed she lived as a goddess on earth. The isolation was absolute. There is a stela from the 26th dynasty. It commemorates a god's wife named Nitocris, adopted into the position at age 6, who served for. The inscription praises her devotion, her wisdom, her unwavering service to the god. It does not mention that she was a child when they gave her the title. It does not mention what those 70 years contained. The archaeological evidence shows something interesting about the god's wife residences within the temple complexes. They were positioned in the innermost precincts, behind multiple walls, accessible only through passages controlled by the priesthood, effectively sealed away from the outside world. For the girl's protection, the official explanation suggests, to maintain her ritual purity. But walls that keep people out also keep people in. Mutnefer was 16 when the high priest died. There was a period of uncertainty, of transition. The new high priest was younger, ambitious, less concerned with maintaining the careful fictions that his predecessor had preserved. Where the old priest had at least maintained the pretense of divine communication, the new one simply issued commands. She realized then what should have been obvious from the beginning. There was no God speaking through these men. There was only men, using a girl's faith and a culture's religious structure to justify taking what they wanted. The God was silent. He had always been silent. But by the time she understood this, it no longer mattered. Understanding changed nothing. The structure remained. The title remained. She remained trapped within it, her understanding of the truth merely an additional weight to carry. She was not the first to know. She would not be the last. The institution of God's wife of Amun officially ended during the Persian conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE. The Persians dismantled much of the Egyptian priesthood's power structure, viewing it as a potential source of rebellion. The temples were secularized, the positions abolished. No record indicates what happened to the last god's wife, whether she was freed or simply abandoned when the institution that had held her dissolved, whether she ever left the temple, whether anyone asked. History moved on to document kings and conquests, the rise and fall of dynasties, the construction of monuments that would outlast memory. The girls who served as God's wives became footnotes, interesting historical curiosities, examples of ancient Egypt's complex religious practices. Their names carefully catalogued, their suffering carefully erased. Mutnefer lived to be 43, not particularly old, but longer than many who held her position. She never left the temple complex. Even after the Persians came, even after the title lost its meaning, she remained within the walls that had held her since 14. The servants found her in the garden near the sacred lake. She had simply stopped, sat down on a stone bench in the morning sun, and did not rise again. They prepared her body according to traditional rites. They inscribed her name on the wall of the temple among all the other gods' wives who had served before her. They recorded that she had been pious, devoted, beloved of the god. They did not record what she had endured. They did not record what she had learned too late. The priests who inherited the temple after the Persian occupation found the title convenient for other purposes. Even without the official position, the chambers remained. The structures remained. The practice of keeping girls within sacred spaces, beyond the reach of law or witness, remained. Different cultures, different gods, different titles. The pattern transcribed across centuries with barely a word changed. We excavate their temples. We translate their inscriptions. We catalog their treasures and marvel at their architecture. We teach their history in classrooms and document their civilization in exhaustive detail. But we do not ask certain questions. We do not follow certain threads. We accept the official accounts, the ceremonial descriptions, the careful language that obscures more than it reveals. The gods' wives of Amun were powerful women, we say. They controlled vast estates. They influenced pharaohs. They were revered throughout Egypt. All of this is true. All of this is incomplete. Mutnefer's name is carved in stone at Karnak. Visitors walk past it every day if they notice it at all. Just another inscription among thousands, worn smooth by time and sand. The walls remember her title. They do not remember her shaking hands. They do not remember the footsteps she learned to fear. They do not remember that she was 14 years old and believed what they told her about serving the gods. History did not forget this. It chose not to remember. Sonnet 45 Claude é uma IA e pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas.